Welcome to another episode of The Voice of Generation Climate, TVOGC. Today we have with us Alvin Lee, who is the regional head of Asia Pacific of Puro.earth. Puro.earth is a registry for carbon removal certificates, and they're playing an extremely vital role in actually helping project developers who are building more carbon sinks for the planet get platformed and then make their projects available for financing from global sources. Alvin, what a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me here, Ani. Good to see you.
Lovely to see you too. So Alvin, what's the best way for you to describe Puro.earth? Because it's a carbon removal registry, you have your own certificate that's been created, the CORC, the carbon dioxide removal certificate. You're creating a marketplace for other marketplaces to get listed on, and then actually bring more capital from, different parts of the world. Puro.earth seems like it's very many things. What's the best way for you to describe it though?
Sure. So Puro.earth is what we refer to as a independent standard and registry. So this is a specific role that has evolved in the carbon market. So as a standard and a registry, our job is several. So one is to develop methodologies, and then we manage those methodologies with a set of governing rules. And then with that, we can work with project developers all around the world who are interested in those methods. And what's unique about Puro is that we are 100% focused on engineered carbon removal. So that's one specific part of the carbon market. Unfortunately for us, we are finding that there are project developers very focused on this space globally. And so they're interested in the methodologies that we have, which people refer to as CDR methodologies. And when we work with them, if we can identify the fact that that project is aligned with that method, then yeah, they are on the path to being audited in the future for their activities. And as you mentioned, the way that we measure a unit of carbon removal in the Puro approach is called a CO2 removal certificate, or CORC for short. So one cork is 1 net ton of carbon removed directly from the atmosphere through various means. So that's what we do. But happy to dive into the details during the discussion.
Absolutely. Want to stress that Puro does not do anything for carbon avoidance. It's purely on carbon removal, which is actually where we want to head. We want to lead the market into as well, right? There's an entire set of carbon avoidance solutions already available: renewable energy, electric mobility, waste to energy. But I think the world needs to move toward building more carbon sinks and higher quality carbon sinks. And within that, there's nature-based solutions and engineered solutions. Puro is fully focusing on engineered solutions. What are some of those solution types that you're focusing on? I know the 5 predominantly that Puro has picked. Could you just unpack what they are and why did you pick those 5?
Sure. So yes, as you rightly point out, the carbon market consists of multiple solutions to help all of us reach the collective goal of driving down global emissions. And then eventually, we refer to what are called hard-to-abate emissions, residual emissions. So Puro made the decision to, within this overall carbon market, focus on addressing that hard-to-abate section. And of course, we're supportive of and collaborate with the other players that are helping the rest of the market. But specifically for the removal portion, for the hard-to-abate, you're also right to point out there are nature-based solutions such as reforestation, afforestation, and others. And then there are what we refer to as engineered solutions. So Puro is further specialized in the engineered space so that we can complement nature removal solutions. So initially, the 5 that we've identified and developed methodologies for are biochar, carbon removal, terrestrial storage of biomass, geologically stored carbon, which encompasses things like direct air capture and storage or bio-CCS. And then a 4th one is carbonated materials. And a 5th one, which is our newest CDR methodology is enhanced rock weathering. So these are the 5 that we've identified. We can talk details about all of them if you like. But the reason why we identified these 5 are several. So in general, Puro is always on the lookout for methodologies which are highly scalable, can be implemented, with the right set of know-how, capital, operational expertise, and ideally can be deployed in multiple jurisdictions. So these are the characteristics that we ideally look for, so that and why is that? Because hard to abate emissions, there are various estimates for what that number is, but the numbers you will often hear could be anywhere from 5 to 15 billion tons per year of CO2 that, because of modern society and industry, it may be difficult to go below that. So we're looking for CDR methods that can neutralize that residual. And that's a big number, obviously. Yeah. And we do see that these 5 methods can address a big portion of that. But of course, we're always on the lookout for other developments and innovations that can come to market and meet some of those characteristics. So, and we do see some of those. So I will also mention that last week we initiated a public consultation for a 6th methodology. And that's what we refer to as ocean storage of biomass. From our initial 5, one of them is called terrestrial storage of biomass. So that's a land-based storage. So this is the counterpart. What are ways that we can leverage the ocean and its unique characteristics to store some kinds of biomass? So that's work in progress. That is currently under public consultation. So after we receive feedback, then we would review that. But eventually we are optimistic it could become a 6th methodology. Yeah. And we do see clearly there's number 7 and 8 on the near-term horizon as well, probably this year, both of which
there are actually more than 10 CDR technologies. But I think durability is an extremely important factor for how you pick which methods to support, right? And the durability is proven ability to have more than 100 years of storage. So which technology locks away carbon for at least 100 years or more, up to 1,000 years. So I think the 5 that you've stated clearly do that, and the concentration is now to add more technologies that, in a proven way, can lock away carbon for more than 100 years. Is that a good way of framing it?
Yes, that's correct. We do come across some solutions that have lower durability, and those are still useful in certain contexts. But for Puro, because of the nature of the market we're trying to serve, yes, we're looking for multi-centuries durability as a minimum. Yes. But quite a few of the methodologies I mentioned would have demonstrated durability beyond a millennia. Yeah. And that also is
the ocean is in fact it's got so much potential. It is already the world's biggest carbon sink. People kind of forget that, like, most of our surface area is water, and the water does absorb a lot of the carbon from the atmosphere. Technologies that kind of combine that are ocean-based can sequester a ton more carbon than we potentially imagine. Have there been a lot of projects that you're seeing in the pipeline for that category as well?
In the ocean category?
Yes. Even though it's not a technology you're supporting yet, are there lots of ocean-based projects coming online?
Yes, definitely. We see that. So despite the fact that we have not formally published any ocean-based methodologies, or some people refer to this as MCDR, marine CDR.
Marine CDR.
Yeah, so again, we're optimistic that some of these will be covered by Puro in the not too distant future. But nevertheless, what we usually see is that project developers move in advance of that. So they anticipate which are methods which are likely going to be accepted. And so as a result, to answer your question, yes, we see quite a lot of projects out there. So just to name several categories, so we see some people exploring how to store biomass safely in the ocean without harm to the marine environment. That's one kind. We see another kind of project where there is some kind of processing of seawater. So that could be for multiple reasons. It could be to extract green hydrogen from seawater. It could be to remove CO2 directly from seawater and catalyze some other follow-on flows. We also see projects where people are adding some kind of a material to the ocean, and for different purposes. So some of the materials we see are for in the category of ocean alkalinity enhancement. In other cases, it can be a material that may attract plankton and leverage some of the CO2 capture capabilities of that. So there's quite a variety, and many of which show great promise.
Very creative methods for sure. Very, very creative methods that are coming out. And that just shows you, like, the basket for CDR is huge. And they're not done with coming up with new methods. So it's really, really wide basket. And I think for that, we need more registries as well, right? That actually segues really well into the role of registries in the CDR space. I think trust is a really, really important lever for the demand side to believe, okay, that these projects are real and they're actually doing equivalent removal somewhere else in the world, right? So if I emit 1 ton of carbon in X part of the world, an equivalent amount of carbon is being removed in another part of the world in a very certified way. So as these methodologies are being created, as people are innovating with new techniques for removing carbon, what is the role of registries, number one? And within that, what is the role of Puro specifically? Because you are focused on CDR, but why was there a need for another registry when there already were a couple that existed before? Perhaps you can talk about the role that they played initially and how that role for registries is evolving and Puro's within it.
Sure. Happy to comment on that. So before I talk about registries specifically, I mean, we would observe that there's a whole chain of participants in the market that are needed to make things work, right? So, of course, on the one end, you have demand. So these are entities that need some form of carbon removal solution or an abatement solution because their business or their activity is emitting. So how does the market deliver a solution to that end buyer? Well, of course, there has to be a solution provider. So these are what usually are called project developers. We actually like to refer to them as suppliers. So somebody who's going to supply the carbon service to the end buyer. So these are the two endpoints of the market. But in the middle, you have numerous other important actors. So firstly, of course, you have measurement and reporting companies that can help the project developer, quantify what they're doing, oftentimes referred to as MRV entities. Then you have the standards. So the standards define and publish methodologies and maintain them so that they can be peer-reviewed, vetted by the market. And of course, the standards operate what's called a registry. So they literally store the credits in the registry once an auditor has confirmed that indeed that project developer is doing what they're saying. And then, yes, those credits could be made directly available to the buyer, or there can be various intermediaries involved, marketplaces, ratings agencies, etc. So it's a complex chain. But now to your question, specifically in the middle, the standards and registries. So historically, what we observed in the market in the past couple of decades were, of course, there were multilateral efforts to define methods, such as CDM. And then, of course, there were individual country efforts to define methodologies. But we also saw the rise of several key voluntary carbon market standards and registries. And those are still around today. But historically, from what we observe, those traditional registries, a lot of them were focused on nature-based solutions, or, as you said, energy efficiency, trying to address improved farming techniques, things like that. So I believe it's safe to say that the majority of activity that they were quantifying would be emission reduction type activities. And we continue to need that, right? Because assuming current levels of emissions are 40 billion tons, there's a lot of work to be done still to reduce that.
Yeah.
So the work that's been done by the traditional registries historically is still needed. But 5 years ago, what Puro observed was there was more and more discussion about the hard-to-abate emissions, or the residual emissions, and that was a big number. So our thinking was that, well, somebody needs to start working on solutions to tackle that. Simultaneously with all the other efforts of emission reduction. And so that was our thinking, that this is a new industry. It was a relatively underserved need 5 years ago, but it clearly is a critical need if the world truly is trying to achieve net zero. There is no net zero without removal of the hard-to-abate or residual emissions. So that was the part of the market that Puro focused on and tried to address. And that's what we're working on today.
Yeah. And I think it's very important to state it's not a zero-sum game at all, right? Like it is, all these solutions stack together. Like you mentioned, the avoided emission market, we still need to avoid about 40 billion tons a year.
Yes.
And the role that earlier players and registries are playing, standards and registries are playing, is very important. But this gap for carbon removal, about 10, 15 billion tons a year, that also needs to be done, definitely needs to be plugged. And I think speed and scale is extremely important, right? Like one of the other advantages that Puro has brought to the market is speed of approvals for scalability. There are lots and lots of project developers, or like you said, suppliers who actually want to go build CDR projects, but they were getting bottlenecked with credit, with verification and then credit issuance. And I think Puro coming in has actually helped speed that up in a lot of ways, so that there can be more credits available for end demand to buy, right? So speed is also one more really important piece of that puzzle, which I think was a problem, but now getting solved because of the work that you do.
Yeah, no, thank you for the feedback. Appreciate that. Yes, we recognize that there's obviously urgent need and challenge, so we're trying our best, as you say, to operate in an efficient manner. And we think our peers are doing the same. Everyone, of course, wants to make these carbon services available efficiently, smoothly, and more readily. And I think whether it's multilateral type of operations or single country or voluntary carbon market kind of activities, everyone will need to move as quickly as possible, but in a robust way. Absolutely. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, and we don't have time, right? In fact, I know one of your personal missions is you call this the decade for climate action. I think the same, like 2020 to 2030, this is the decade for climate action. We have to solve as much of this problem as we can now. And we don't really have a lot of time to have these bottlenecks be a problem, right? So I think that issuance and registry bottleneck, getting de-bottlenecked, is a really, really important part of the conversation that I wanted to bring up too, and the really critical role that Puro is playing in that. What is an example of a project from the supply side that you have worked with that has been just a absolutely like shining case in point of everything going right? I think it doesn't always go right, but where did it just fall in place? Where the project or the supply was there, the demand side customer came and found that project developer because of the intermediary steps being completely solved for. With market makers, with the standard and registry, where did it all go right? And can you talk a little bit about that case study?
Sure. Well, actually, there are quite a few very exciting examples like that. But since we're both sitting in Asia, I feel compelled to speak about a case that's in region. So we've been very excited in our work with Varaha, which is an India-based project developer. And so, of course, Varaha is involved with various kinds of carbon projects. But we started speaking to them at Carbon Forward Asia 2 years ago. And this is an example, I think, of why carbon meetings are very useful and events. It's a very important venue to exchange ideas. So I happened to meet with the CEO Madhur at Carbon Forward Asia 2023 edition. And we were chatting and we stayed in touch. And then what what we discerned was that his team had interest in industrial biochar, carbon removal. And so we received information about a particular facility that they had identified that has the right equipment. And then we went through step by step. Looking at what's the feedstock that you're going to use to transform the temporarily stored carbon into a permanent stored carbon. What's the technology look like, and how are you putting the biochar into the ground eventually to complete the loop of storage. So that took quite some time. Those early discussions probably took close to a year, but when it was clear that the idea was feasible, then we worked with them as they were preparing to go to audit, and we looked at their information, and eventually they were audited by VVB and issued credits in October of 2024. So it was a really good journey. That was the first step for them to add to their portfolio. And I think what I found interesting about that transaction was that they had been actively speaking with intermediaries already. And so very soon after, DRW Artemeter partnered with them to basically take on the role of distributing those credits. So, and I think we will see more and more of that important role of let's call them commodity intermediaries to bring liquidity to that market. So that was a modest size issuance, but that was, I think that enabled Varaha to show to the world that yes, you could do industrial biochar in the way they were conceiving, and I'm sure that will lead to larger issuances for them in the future at that facility. But a second very important thing that we noticed about that transaction was that because they were able to prove to the world that you can make industrial biochar from agricultural residues and do that in India, that got them on the radar with Google. So as they have openly spoken about with the market, I think that gave their potential client, Google, greater confidence in what the company was doing. And just a couple weeks ago, they announced a historic offtake where Google is committed to work with Varaha to fund removal of, I believe it's 100,000 tons of CO2 net over a 5-year period. In this case, it will be more of an invasive species feedstock as opposed to agriculture, but the technology concept is the same, but it has different kinds of community benefits relating to clearing invasive species as opposed to clearing agricultural waste. So I think that's a really nice arc where we've seen over close to 2-year period now, an amazing set of developments. And I think it will unlock a number of other important developments, not only in this region, but probably other regions as well.
And that is a model you imagine can be replicated very many times over by very many different project developers or suppliers around the world, but particularly in Asia Pacific, right? Like there's this entire notion of capital flows from the global north to the global south. It's repeated so often at every summit, every conference, every event, and there's this notion that past polluters have to pay for the developing world's development / carbon removal at the same time. So in the flow of capital from the global north to the global south, which is obviously changing geopolitically currently too, with the US backing out of the Paris Climate Accords. How do you see that play out? Capital flow from the global north to the global south, and the kind of projects that you're talking about, this industrial biochar project and other CDR projects. Do you feel like predominantly they're going to be based in Asia Pacific, in Latin America, and Africa? How do you see that geographic distribution of these CDR projects?
Yeah, so firstly, to your point about are these replicable? Yes, we believe they are, and that's exactly what we were hoping to see. As I mentioned, when Puro develops methodologies, we're looking for methods that can be broadly applied in a range of different jurisdictions, specific local circumstances, etc. So, although the example that I cited was from India and South Asia, yes, we already see projects of this nature in Latin America and Africa. We're starting to see some of these emerge in Southeast Asia as well. And yes, definitely they can be replicated. So we do see that there will continue to be support from the north into these projects because for various reasons, I think. A lot of the buyers may have supply chain in some of these regions. In other cases, they have a specific directive where they'd like to help address specific ESG challenges in these regions, whether it's excessive agricultural waste or invasive species, things like that. And also, it could be a cost advantage. Maybe it's better to deliver the carbon service where there's abundant biomass and/or unique circumstances of well-priced renewable energy, things like that. So we expect to see that continue. We hope, despite current geopolitical challenges. But I would also highlight that because there's a lot of capital in the north, there are really interesting projects that are in the north as well. So it's not that I don't think there's a monopoly per se on the services that to be delivered from the south. We'd love to see that continue to happen, but there are some really exciting projects up north too.
They should really be everywhere, right? I think climate action should be localized as well in every part of the world. But I mean, the most at-risk places in the world are kind of along the equator, and there's this entire notion too, which I kind of agree with, which is the most number of projects should also be where the most climate disaster or climate impact will be felt. So, yeah, I think that line gets stated a lot, global north to the global south, and we can only hope that more of these projects will be built in Latin America and Africa and in Asia Pacific, especially South Asia. But really, these projects should be based anywhere. And the pricing of projects, I think it's a cost advantage to do it in these places. It is definitely more expensive to build the same project, I guess, in more developed part of the world. But how do you then arrive at a uniform rate of a credit sold? Because I saw that, your average is about 150, 155 euros per cork or per carbon credit that you have facilitated, right? How did you arrive at that pricing? So if there's a project built in the globe, somewhere in the industrialized developed world, versus a project built in India or in Bangladesh, how do you arrive at that average price point? Can you just run us through the math?
Okay, sure. As a preface, I want to highlight that as a standard and a registry, so our principal focus is to identify these methodologies and then work with project developers, suppliers to utilize them. And once those credits are generated, you can think of them as assets that are controlled by the project developer. It's just that Puro has the registry where the credits sit there, but these are not our assets. And likewise, we are not operating a marketplace. So the project developers would directly engage in B2B transactions with buyers, or they may choose to show their price on an external marketplace. That could be an exchange, or that could be a specialized marketplace like that. Any information you see on Puro's website is actually just the supplier saying, "Well, we'd like to offer units at these prices. Contact us." But you cannot transact on Puro. So with that as a preface, couple things to be aware of is that there are a range of these project developer suppliers all over the world. Each of them sets their own offer price, actually. So when you talk about an average, you're right. We can observe what were the posted offer prices across a range of projects and literally just compute what that average is. But is that the market or not? Well, yes, it's one view of the market, but ultimately a buyer needs to either contact that supplier or work with a specialized entity like Climes to navigate that. So that's one observation. But in terms of the trends, yes, I mean we would observe in the CDR space there's pricing that ranges anywhere from probably $150 a ton for CDR, up towards over 1,000, depending on supply and level of maturity. So the market's clearly still early, because the market is still trying to figure out, well, what are all the different solutions we need to deliver CDR such that the combined total could get to 5, 10, or even 15 billion tons a year. So there's not one price. There's a range of prices. And we see that the early pioneers who are buying these, they recognize that it's too early just to bet on only one thing. So they're buying a range of different CDR credits. And yes, they're paying a range of prices for that. But since these are mainly publicly listed companies, they have CFOs and shareholders they got to be accountable to. So they generally try to target their net activity to arrive at a certain average. And I would argue gradually over time they want that average price to come down. Yes. I will cite one fact to you, which is quite interesting. So Stanford University, they have a sustainability school that was launched a couple of years back. And so they're working on a number of different things, but their very first, what they call flagship destination, was that they want to conduct research that would enable a global CDR market to be, I think, 10 billion tons a year capacity at below $100 a ton removal. So they've actually highlighted that the research should be pushing in to enable that outcome. Right, so the world is not there yet today. The average across all CDRs is higher than that, and some prices are much higher than that. But you can see that over time, if you can deliver a very large-scale market with prices that are high, but within reason, you can say, or comparable to the current EU emissions price, then you start to have a bigger and bigger and functioning market.
That is a really incredible goal to have. 10 million tons under $100 price point per credit. And I think that's the level of scale we need, and that's a price point where a lot more demand also comes in. Right? It's not just the really well endowed tech companies that can come and pay extremely high price points. And they're kind of paying to bring down the price of these projects as well, right? They kind of like the frontiers of the world. They are literally at the frontier of bringing down CDR prices so that far more market players can come in and have access to these over time. Actually, I was going to ask you, like, where do you see the price of CDR settling, where more mass market participation can happen? I think that $80 to $100 range is a really good benchmark to set. At that price point, assuming we do get there, do you feel like there's going to be there's a chicken and egg question, right? Do you feel like there's going to be a demand side problem or a supply side problem? Which one really needs to be solved currently, and then even leading up to that $80 to $100 price point? Because everybody says, where's my demand? But everybody also says, where's the high quality supply?
Yeah. I would observe that we're quite fortunate to have pioneers on both sides at the moment. Right? There are pioneer buyers who are able to pay a higher than average price today just to kickstart the market. So, and I think everyone's familiar with who those are. These are tech companies, financial firms, professional services companies, but also increasingly we're seeing aviation be involved to drive this market. So that's on the demand side. And on the supply side, yes, there are numerous companies already implementing the 5 existing methodologies we talked about, as well as the 3 up-and-coming kind of methodologies that we alluded to. But yeah, this doesn't mean that we're now at a large-scale global market. It's still early stage, right? Because we're talking about, in total numbers, millions of tons still. So that's very far still from the multi-billion ton kind of market. So what would be the price that enables that? Well, hard to say, but we would just observe the following, right? If you're a company operating in Europe today, under some of the sectors, you are obligated to pay the EU emission cost. And so that's a pretty high number. It's not that far from $100. And so businesses already need to operate with that in mind, that if your business is emitting carbon, well, the cost is close to $100. So you need to figure out a way to either emit a lot less carbon or figure out how to pay that emission cost. And then also because of the rules for cross-border adjustment, CBAM, it essentially is impacting people who are dealing with Europe. So it becomes a global kind of a challenge. So is that the number? Not sure, but it is a number we observe in the market, that people are at least having to think about long term. How would I run a business where if I have residual emissions, it's going to cost me about $100. But hopefully with innovation and scale, maybe that price maybe a abatement price could be lower. Not sure, but that's an aspiration, right?
Yeah.
And even if future carbon removal prices don't land on average below 100, we still think they're needed, and the market will have to figure out how to cope with what is that eventual landing price, because we would anticipate there will be more and more regulation over time across more jurisdictions where the price gets higher. Right? Europe obviously has a high emission price today, whereas in Asia, not every country even has a price, but the ones that have, it's still quite a bit lower. So it will take time for those to normalize across regions.
Got it. And a lot of what we've been talking about is about the voluntary carbon market and the players who are building in that space. But what you just referred to is governments playing their role to use the compliance to grow the market even further, right? And actually mandate that the players and actors within their countries do neutralize their residual emissions. So that compliance market is obviously the far bigger market that we all want converging with the voluntary market. And that's the big tailwind, I guess, would really, really accelerate the entire CDR space. Do you see that as a likelihood, convergence of voluntary market with compliance market? Because in a way, they're still kind of operating parallelly, right now. The voluntary market is what's being used to bring down CDR prices by really, forward-looking tech companies and, like you said, finance companies and aviation companies. But the compliance market is still largely playing in a very different category of already well-priced, mass-scale emissions reductions. Right? So when does that convergence happen? Where this perfect market discovery, perfect access to any credit from any player at anywhere in the world at any given time.
Sure. Well, I cannot answer that question, but we can observe the fact that there are some convergence points, and then from there we can hypothesize what that would look like, right? But let me share some observations, at least from a carbon removal perspective.
Yeah.
Right? So again, starting with Europe, you have a huge compliance market, and today it's mostly driven around paying for the right to emit. But there will be rules emerging around how a carbon removal service fits into that in Europe, and it will be up to that. It will be up to them to define how that works. Does that interact at all with the current voluntary carbon market, or is it something new they'll set up? We'll see. Likewise, we've observed in markets like Japan, where there are some voluntary emissions trading activities happening now, but are will become mandatory in future phases. And already there's some discussion about, what would be the role of credits that are relating to removals? How would it play into the Japanese market? So we're starting to see that already in a few different jurisdictions, and I would expect to see more and more of that over time. But the harmonization probably would take quite a bit of time because what we observe today is that the methodologies and development is a bit faster in the voluntary market. And it will take more time, I think, for different jurisdictions to design and implement their compliance markets. So that's why we have two operating simultaneously now. But And we see a few interface points emerging, but it will be, I think, clearer over time. It'll probably take the rest of this decade to understand how that works.
I like that word that you use, harmonization. Yeah, there's so many players, right? And like you said, it's not one player who can do it all. We need lots of players in the entire value chain, connecting demand all the way to supply. And the harmonization between of that, plus the harmonization of voluntary with compliance markets. Yeah, it's complicated, but I think this is the decade to make it happen as well.
Indeed.
What do you think what is one trait you admire in the leaders who are actually building these projects? Like, what does it take to build a project? What is something you found as a common trait, and what do you find admirable in them?
Well, I mean, that's probably a trait in any industry, but it takes an amazing amount of perseverance and conviction to launch these kinds of new industries. So in general, I think carbon services industries is no different than launching any other company where you're taking huge amount of risk based on some view of the future and that conviction. So in general, these kind of entrepreneurial pursuits are tough. And then I would say in the carbon world, it's further compounded by the fact that there's, as we all know, there's a lot of uncertainties and even negative news in general in the market. And so you need to cut through that, right? Just because there's maybe concern about one particular project or activity doesn't mean the whole market should be written off, right? And so I think entrepreneurs, of course, understand that, but they have the additional tough task of explaining that, well, what I'm doing is addressing something different, and we're going to do it right. So, yeah, big challenge. So lots of perseverance and patience is needed. And yeah, we have great respect for the suppliers that we talk to, because they've taken those steps, right? They've raised some initial capital, or they've built a pilot, and now they're trying to scale up. And then there's a continuous need to find customers, raise additional financing, counter any general negative press in the market, so that they can explain what they're doing is not that.
Yeah, a lot of perseverance and patience and just the ability to keep going, right? Resilience to just keep going. Because you're right, the last couple of years have been pretty brutal, perception-wise, towards the carbon markets, right? One bad Guardian article here and another article there, and everybody starts speaking out. But the ability to just keep going on and actually build towards better quality, more durability, more transparency. I think that's a very common trait in most phenomenal project developers / suppliers. And I think I asked that question just so that the next set of people who are actually thinking about building a project walk into this knowing that's a prerequisite as well. This is not a short-term game at all. I want to just call out one statement that I read from you, which talks about your own optimism. I hold the optimistic view that the combined resources of the private and public capital can rise to the challenge of funding critical sustainable development and climate change mitigation goals. I am dedicated to applying my experience with engineers, sustainability chiefs, investors, financial institutions, regulators, and capital market participants to develop practical solutions together with like-minded change makers. That's really beautiful. And while you've stated this, with the state of the world we're in now, do you feel like this is the time for us to double down, or for us to actually kind of like be cautiously optimistic or be cautious through the period, geopolitically that we're going through? What are you choosing to do?
Yes, so I should be no surprise to you that we're in the camp. I'm in the camp that we have to double down. We cannot take our eye off the goal. And what I observe is that there are plenty of people who are charging forward despite various kinds of headwinds. So, just to highlight several parts of the world, right? So we continue to see amazing project developers out there who've identified important things to do, whether it's engineered solutions or nature solutions or, changing how business operates to lower emissions, we continue to see people who have amazing ideas, have the will to take a chance to launch a project or scale up an existing project. So I think that's fantastic news. We see buyers. So we continue to see buyers who believe that, yes, this is the right thing to do, and we will stay the course. Yes, we do recognize that some of those buyers may be facing increasing challenge in the boardroom, right? In the boardroom, those buyers, they might be hearing that, hey, why are you doing this? The winds are shifting.
Yeah, why are we spending on this, right?
Right, the winds are shifting, but and yes, I'm sure there will be some conversations, many conversations like that in boardrooms, and yes, maybe some corporates will be driven to be slower or much more cautious, and that's a reality. But we see that those with highest conviction and very clear engagement with their board and the public will stay the course. As we see, we continue to see interesting and amazing announcements from buyers. And then in the middle, yeah, we see some interesting things in the financing space. So it is true. We do see some financial institutions now. They have to be cautious about how they label their support for the sector. And what I observe is that suddenly it's maybe a bit risky to call what you're doing as ESG, sadly.
Yeah.
But what we do observe is that it's still okay for financiers to say that, well, we're supporting climate tech or we're supporting sustainability. So some of it is a bit like phraseology. So, yes, it's just a fact of life now that entities have to be careful how they describe what they're doing. And I think that's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. But nevertheless, there are ways that you can describe what you're doing and allow you to carry on and continue to finance and support these important projects. So in short, time to double down. But yes, there are headwinds, but I think these headwinds can be navigated.
Yeah, and I think that beacon of hope and optimism is extremely important. I don't think we can afford to back down. I don't think we're giving up on our climate goals at all as a species. And I think this is, like you said, the time to double down and actually speed up. There is no other option, right? And I think it's just about adjusting our terminologies and adjusting the way we communicate and finding other people like us who actually are looking to double down as well. Because there are a lot of people out there in the world who really do want to do good. Whether they're headwinds or not, I think, yeah, like CDR has to accelerate this decade. And Alvin, can't thank you enough for what you do at Puro and Puro itself for really, championing the cause of CDR and giving people a better way to actually build projects that are really, really important for this planet. Thank you so much for your time, and please keep championing the CDR movement forward.
Thank you. We really appreciate the encouragement and the shout-outs. Been great talking today. We look forward, of course, to continue working with you and all the other Gen C constituents.
Gen C, yes.
Yeah, there's lots happening, and we're very encouraged by what we see out there.
Thank you, Alvin.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.